Before we wrap up, I want to look at the 7 core traits which create a cinematic lighting in a scene. I've gone ahead and stolen this list from Lewis Potts. He's a fantastic Australian DP that does sort of commercial and narrative stuff. His information is going to be in the description of this video. These 7 core principles, if you sort of learn nothing else from this video, if you want to make an image just look really pretty, you can take a look at these 7 core principles. The first trait is backlight. I think all great scenes have some sort of backlight going on in the shot. It just really helps create dimension and shape in the scene. As I mentioned, you can definitely overdo this, but every scene seems to work really well with some element of backlight going on. The really important thing is depth. Now, depth does exist from a camera perspective as well, but you can create depth with lighting. Consider about the sort of volume of light that you're working with. Maybe you want to add some sort of atmosphere like a haze machine, and you can create a sense of depth with how the light interacts with the rest of the scene. If I don't put any light behind me whatsoever, I'm going to lose all sense of depth. So it is important to use light to your advantage to show off the depth in the scene. People are drawn to depth. There's something innately cinematic about a scene with depth. Depth meaning space between the foreground or the midground and your background. Most classically cinematic lighting involves some sort of silhouette. And when I say silhouette, I don't specifically mean a blacked out in a completely white background. But what I do mean is the background having almost a higher level than the foreground, or some elements of it having a higher level than the foreground. You'll find this in a lot of different places. An example, of course, is that upstage technique, where maybe we even have a really strong practical that's behind the subject and it's creating a bit of shadow, and it may be even like one half of their body is completely black, so it is completely silhouetted. Or maybe it's just a lower level in front, but some sort of dimension where we're working with actually a lot of darkness in the front of the frame compared to the back. I think why we can struggle with dealing with this concept sometimes is that goes against the grain of how we think to light things if we're not coming from sort of a film background. Typically, if we're thinking of sort of Instagram, social media, we're thinking of very high key type stuff. We're also looking at making sure your subject is bright and well lit. A big reason for that is because we're working with cameras, phones, which have automatic exposure. We can't change the exposure level. So usually what your phone will do is it will try to expose for the face in the scene, and everything else will be relative to whatever your face is doing. Because we're working with cameras where you can choose how you expose your image, you can actually work with dark being in front and light being behind. It can be a little bit counterintuitive to start off with, but again, I challenge you to watch one of your favorite films and you'll notice how they do deal with shadow and darkness being in the foreground as well. The next principle is checkerboard lighting, where you've got patches of dark and light throughout your scene. From left to right, you can see that it goes through shadow and through light. A checkerboard basically means, you have that change of light and dark from one side of the screen to the other, from left to right or up to down, rather than having the entire screen is very bright or very dark. You do actually have those elements where there's patches of light and patches of dark. That is a classically cinematic lighting look. The 6th principle of a classically cinematic image is practicals. We love practicals. They're in everyday life. We know how they work, and they really tie us into the scene. And as mentioned, they're a really great way of motivating existing light in the scene. And the final principle is reflections. A great way of creating reflections in your scene is maybe putting water on the ground if you're in a car park outside, or perhaps there's different surfaces or different textures in your scene which you can create reflections from. It doesn't have to be a complete a mirror of the subject which is in the frame, but it just creates this sort of extra layer of texture within your scene. I think ultimately light doesn't work if there's no texture to be going on with. If light is only on one sort of flat level where it's in the entirely textureless background or subject, you lose all dimension. So adding reflections and texture into your scene is a great way of seeing how it interacts, seeing how it shapes.